Hello, Agony Aunties. I lost my dad 9 years ago. I then lost my mum 3 years after that. Both were 67. I completely relate to this and agree that the life stories are what I focus on now. But I have been thrown back into death stories as my poor father was given Hep C from a blood transfusion in the 80s while battling with cancer. He spent 15 years in bad health, culminating in a liver transplant in 2012. All the news in the press about the blood inquiry I'm now hearing has thrown me right back into all-consuming grief, like it happened yesterday. I thought I'd dealt with my dad's death as it seemed to make sense when he died, but now it just seems senseless. Even though I knew he'd been given, as he called it, bad blood, I never heard him get angry, so I wasn't either. That is quite a complex psychological challenge, isn't it, to face, of kind of re-grieving the death of her dad. This is the blood transfusion inquiry, where I think 3,000 people died from contaminated blood, and it was in the 80s, so it's taken like 40 years for the inquiry to really happen and for people to get compensation. And I've actually heard many stories personally of one son, both his parents died from the blood contamination, so he was orphaned by it. So there are some really horrifying stories. But my first kind of thought is, of course she feels like this, because when you hear stories that relate to your experience, it does reignite. It's like we've talked about many times. It's not like you forget and move on. It's like your relationship with her dad is still in her, and she was sort of at peace with it until this has kind of thrown a bomb into that.
Yes, and what happened to your dad was a trauma. And what happens with trauma is when you have a trigger, like this was a trigger, it doesn't feel distance. It feels like you're kind of in it
It's like
again because
today,
that's,
yeah.
yeah, because that's what is happening in your system, in your brain. And I was really curious about your dad not expressing any anger about it, and therefore you kind of took your lead from him. And maybe it sort of felt like, well, if he's not angry, then
I have no
it's not
right to
my
be.
place. It's not my place
Mm,
to be
mm.
angry. And obviously, I don't know anything about your dad or you or your sort of family history, but I think there's a place for anger here. And I wonder what happened to that unexpressed anger. I wonder what happened to it in you. I wonder what happened to it in him. And maybe he was just really able to accept this appalling injustice. But anger is also like an energy that we need and we need to
It's a
express it, or
force.
it's a
Mm,
force, or it gets kind of trapped in our
mm.
bodies. And I think I would be curious for you about getting in touch with your own anger in relation to what happened, because maybe that's never been an option for you so far.
A question around how might you take care of yourself while reading the news? It's like your inner personal world and the external news are colliding. Your very deeply intimate pain is also then being politicized and publicized, and lots of other stories. And that makes a lot of sense that a story you had accommodated is now changed, and now that story isn't a story that you can be comfortable with. You're going to have to relearn how to make sense of and sit alongside this new version of the story that includes your anger and the wider general failure of all the other people who have been hurt and lost along the way. But I wonder if either of you had any thoughts about taking care of yourself when this kind of collision happens. It's something you're processing, so you're going to want to read about it and you're going to want to understand and make sense. And at the same time, there's going to be a lot of other people's stuff and political agendas and things you can't control about the inquiry and how it goes ahead and how it ends. Thinking of other big inquiries like Hillsborough, Grenfell. These are very difficult things for the people who were intimately involved to go through, even if you're not actually in the legal case.
I mean, I really agree with both of you. You're right. I think you need to find a way of expressing your anger and also being mindful about when you're watching the news. It's like reading a letter from the doctor. You don't just read it while you're kind of just in the tube in any place. You kind of sit down and put yourself in a safe place so that you can be supported and have someone with you. So I'd be very aware of reading the news and having support afterwards. And I wonder, as a way of expressing anger, maybe write lots of letters to people that you want to write letters to. Write to your dad. I don't know how the rest of your family are, whether they've been affected in the same way as you. Talking together about how you feel, talking about it collectively might be helpful. It might not, because you might all have very different views, but that might be helpful as well.
I think there's something to do with the powerlessness, that this didn't have to happen, and it happened, and it was completely out of anybody's, well, your dad's control, your control. And I think when
what was given to him to make him better killed him in the end.
Yeah, yes. And 15 years of ill health before that. So it wasn't, gosh, I mean, so that's, I think that experience, it takes the sort of ground from under you, like the things that the system that you should trust. The doctors, and suddenly like your whole world is sort of suddenly completely inversed of the people who are supposed to be looking after my dad actually gave him something that killed him, but he thought he was doing the right thing because he was doing the right thing. I mean, that's just, it's such a huge sort of sense of like out of controlness and injustice and unfairness that like even in my system, just sort of thinking about this, like it makes me feel, I can feel my stomach sort of
churning,
clenching inside. So I think it's also about acknowledging to yourself how incredibly hard and painful and complicated this process is, and there's probably not a sort of magic thing that can stop that can make that not true. And I think I agree in terms of being mindful about news consumption and things like that. I also think, at least this is my personal experience rather than my professional experience, is when something is on your mind, you see it anywhere, you see it everywhere anyway. So it doesn't have to be, so like example, maybe this is different, but like when you're doing fertility treatment, you're not necessarily like seeking out things about pregnancy, but you just sort of suddenly everyone's pregnant and you see babies everywhere. So I do think
you're very alert
when you've got something that's really just very present on your mind, somehow something always happens where you kind of see it everywhere, even if it's not specifically on the news or a film or whatever. So I think it is sort of, that is part of maybe to do with self-compassion, but also a kind of awareness that it probably will come up a lot, regardless.
So I have two kind of final thoughts, and again, like Em and Soph, I don't know if these would be helpful. One is that the anger going inward then does contaminate every other feeling that you have. And so finding ways of expressing your anger, like we said, but also like recognizing that you're expressing it with acknowledgement of how painful and hurtful this is, but with the intention that you want to move forward, because these are the kinds of experiences that can knot you forever. So my other thought is that this will take a long time, much longer than you want. But there is a kind of attachment to the fury that can make you get stuck and then have complicated chronic grief. So I'm saying two things at the same time, which is I hope your intention is to find a way of going forward so that you can engage and live your life, and find ways of managing your grief and expressing it so that you can find a way of accommodating it.
I'm so sorry that this happened to you, this happened to your dad, to your family.
Terrible thing. So thank you for your question. And if it would help others, do please share it. And do please send us questions. Often DM me on my Instagram, Julia Samuel MBE, because we really do like hearing from you. And if you rate and subscribe to the podcast, it helps others find us and spread the word. And we'd be really appreciative of that. But mainly we're appreciative of you listening. So thank you very much.